It started like any other Saturday morning. Birds chirping, sun rising over the horizon, my barn standing proudly at the edge of my property. This wasn't just a barn. It was my sanctuary, my little world of tools, memories, and the old tractor that had been in my family for generations. I brewed my coffee, stepped outside, and took in the fresh smell of hay and morning dew. But today, everything was about to change. Out of nowhere, I noticed massive construction equipment rolling onto my land, bulldozers, dump trucks, and at the helm, the HOA contractor, clipboard in hand, looking far too pleased with himself. My stomach sank. "What are you doing here?" I shouted, running toward them. The foreman barely glanced at me. "We have authorization. This barn is in violation. HOA code. Needs to be demolished." I laughed nervously, thinking it had to be a mistake. I had all the permits. The barn was on my property. And, most importantly, I was a long-standing member of this community. "You can't just. This is my land," he smirked. "Legal says otherwise. You've been warned." I felt my heart pound. Months of battles with the HOA had led to this. From petty fines over a crooked fence to complaints about my overgrown garden. I knew this wasn't about the rules. It was about power. They wanted to show me I had no say. And suddenly, it clicked. This wasn't just about a barn. This was about me standing up. And I wasn't about to let them win. I ran back into the house, my mind racing. Memories of this place flashed through me. The late nights repairing the barn roof. Laughter from friends during summer barbecues. Quiet mornings with coffee, and the sound of cows lowing in the distance. Could I really let some corporate suit HOA demolish that? Not without a fight. I needed a plan. And then, like a lightning bolt, I remembered the resort lake they'd built downstream. A man-made paradise for the HOA members and their weekend guests. I knew the dam valve was accessible. I'd always been careful not to touch it. It wasn't mine, technically, but now. Desperate times called for bold measures. I grabbed my laptop, dug into the HOA's public permits, and checked the water flow schematics. If I could manipulate the dam, just enough, maybe I could send a little message. Something that said, "You don't demolish my property without consequences." By the time I returned outside, the barn was halfway torn apart. Splintered wood, a broken door, nails sticking out like claws. I clenched my fists, staring at the chaos, tasting the bitter anger that had been building for months. And then I smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a victory smile yet, a calculating, patient smile. I had just realized that this was no longer about stopping them. It was about showing them exactly what happens when you underestimate someone. They tore the roof off like it was paper. By noon, the barn looked like a memory someone had sketched in haste and then erased. I stood on my porch with the bitter taste of coffee and revenge in my mouth, watching men in orange vests carry out a decision that had been made in a fluorescent-lit room where none of my history mattered. People walked by, pretending it was just another afternoon. The HOA rep, Mr. Langley, with the same smile he used at every meeting, handed me a form that might as well have been a receipt for my life's work. "We followed procedure," he said, voice smooth as lacquer. "We sent notices." He could have sent notes on cloud stationery for all I cared. My heart did that odd tight thing it does when heat rises into anger, and I felt the shape of what I would do next, forming like a tool coming into my palm. I didn't act that day. You don't win with theatrics. You win with leverage. So I did something more boring. I listened and I read. Between the whine of saws and the distant slap of tarps, I dug through the HOA's public records, everything that was available online, and everything at the binder-heavy office across town. There were maps, maintenance logs, contractor invoices for the resort lake, and a beautifully printed brochure that promised exclusive shoreline access to homeowners who'd paid their dues, and smiled at the right board members. The resort's dam, small, municipal-sounding, and very much on their property, showed up in the diagrams. It was connected to a valve house. The valve house was connected to a short dirt road that emptied out at the end of the resort property by the boat slips and the cafe that served coffee with tiny flag toothpicks. I'll say this for the HOA. They'd built everything to be admired, not defended. Bright signs, polite landscaping, a security gate with a board guard who checked badges like he checked weather. The maps made the valve look like a dot, a button the HOA pressed to keep their little paradise calm and contained. In the real-life version of the map, a hand could be a problem or a solution, depending on whether you were trying to save a barn or ruin a weekend. Late that night, I walked the boundary lines under the sky, which had the small mercy of smearing out guilt in stars. The barn was a pile of timbers and characterless lumber. My hands still smelled faintly of sawdust and oil. I took pictures with my phone for record. Demolition progress, contractor IDs, the timestamp, and I texted a few friends who'd been supportive during our late-night meetings with HOA bylaws and coffee. They didn't lecture. They listened. That night, I slept badly and dreamed of water finding the path of least resistance. There was a practical side to all of this that I couldn't ignore. Even the idea of messing with a dam is theatrical if you describe it in mechanical detail, but any theatre that risks lives or real harm crosses a line I wouldn't step over. I'm not a vindictive lunatic. I'm a man with a rake and a stubborn streak. What I planned had to hurt them where it would sting the most. Public embarrassment, the smell of the board's control slipping away, an exposure of hypocrisy, without endangering the people who frequented the resort or the wildlife that had nothing to do with HOA grudges. I promised myself I'd stay on the right side of that thin moral fence. What I wanted was spectacle, not catastrophe. The next week I scouted with the patience of an old fisherman setting nets. I learned the guard's rotation, nap from 11:30 to 12:15, more alert on weekends, when the cafe staff yelled more cheerfully. I watched where the board members parked. Mrs. Hargreave liked the shaded spots near the cafe. Mr. Langley favoured the gravel lot by the tennis courts. The valve house was smaller than I'd expected, more of a maintenance shed than a fortress. A rusting steel door, a brass plaque that read, "Authorised personnel only," and a narrow gravel path, cameras, one on a pole by the boat slips, blinking like a lazy eye. The map had been honest. The valve house sat close enough to shore that a determined person could be seen, but far enough that someone could argue plausible deniability. Perfect for a message. I built the message like a carpenter builds a chair, strong at the joints, obvious in the shape. It would be symbolic, sticky in people's memories, and it would force the HOA to face the consequences of their own pride and secrecy. For days I sketched ideas, nothing that involved harm, nothing that would hurt the lake, the folks who fished there, or the kids who brought bread for the geese. My revenge had to be surgical, a public reveal, evidence of wrongdoing, and a spectacle of lost control for the people who love to control. There's a peculiar joy in planning when you know what's at stake. Not joy in the damage, but the kind that comes from a clarity of purpose. The barn had been torn down, but the truth about how they chose to exercise power could be pried open. I started compiling everything in a folder: the builder's permits for the resort, inconsistencies in maintenance logs, a few unsigned memos from contractors that hinted at cost-cutting and code skipping. There were also the little human things, photos of HOA parties, where board members were photographed with contractors, laughing in front of the very lake they loved. The contrast between their sparkle and my ruined barn was the kindling. I reached out to a local reporter I'd chatted with at a farmer's market years ago. she owed me a favor. Or maybe she just liked the idea of chasing powerful people who thought themselves untouchable. I didn't lay out a plan. I simply said there were discrepancies in the HOA's records and that something had been demolished under questionable authority. That was enough to get her attention. She asked for documents. I fed them the ones I could, the ones that smelled like truth. She asked for anonymity. I agreed. A reporter has a different kind of leverage than a man with a toolbox. Her words carry into print like a bell. Meanwhile, the HOA doubled down on their posture of righteousness. Notices appeared on the bulletin board declaring compliance and duty, framed in type that said, "We did this for safety." They sent a letter, formally polite, about community standards. I read it and smelled the arrogance. It was the smell that made me think of a public reveal. If they wanted to be moral purists, let them be moral purists, under the light of scrutiny. I also had to think about the people. People who used the resort lake didn't deserve drama. I imagined the families who rented the cabins, the kids on paddleboards, the elderly men who fed the ducks at dawn. If my message scared them or endangered them, I'd be no better than the HOA. So when the idea of turning the valve into a literal threat raised its ugly head, I shut it down. Instead, the shutting I planned would be metaphorical, an act that would highlight the HOA's dependency on stage perfection and their fear of messiness. I would not interfere with water levels. I would interfere with their image. There's a narrow window between deciding to act and making sure the act is clean and impossible to misconstrue as malicious. I spent a long evening drafting an anonymous package. Photos of the demolished barn, timestamps, links to the HOA's maintenance discrepancies, redacted copies of contractor emails. I included an unsigned note that said nothing threatening, only a single line. Your paradise looks better in brochures than it does under scrutiny. The package went into a plain envelope with no return address and a polite stamp, and I left it on the resort manager's desk one night when the staff were busy with an event and the manager stepped out to take a call. Walking back across the gravel, my breath steamed in front of me like a proof of something. The reaction was immediate. Within 2 days, the resort's polished veneer cracked into stories. Board members scurried, hired a PR consultant who smelled of lemon and evasions, and convened an emergency meeting for which the attendees were told to bring only approved questions. The reporter I'd contacted called to say she was digging, and could I meet, off the record, in a diner with bad coffee and better acoustics. I gave her the timeline, the folder, and the names of the contractors who might talk if asked the right way. She smiled with that reporter's half smile that says, "She smelled blood in the water and intends to fish." "You have to be careful," she said quietly, not asking, more stating an observation. "We can puncture them, but don't put people at risk," I promised. I always keep my promises about things that matter. As the HOA circled the wagons, I watched their campfires. Langley fumed. In voicemail recordings the reporter had somehow coaxed out, and Mrs. Hargreaves' public statements read like apologetic hymns, tailored to the crowd. I felt the satisfaction of leverage, but also the steady creep of something like pity. Power wears well on some people until it doesn't. That softness where arrogance used to be makes for a beautiful reveal. It is not always about winning. Sometimes it's about showing, and still, the valve house sat there, unknowing, a little shed with a tarnished plaque, and a padlock more cosmetic than functional. In my dreams, it became theatre. Light angled just so, a crowd murmuring at the edge of the water. Board members realizing their paradise was only as stable as their stories. I would not drown the dock or flood the cafe. I would drown the narrative that allowed them to flatten my barn without consequence. The night I finally moved, I drove to the resort under a moon that hid behind a thin veil of cloud. I parked where the trees would swallow the taillights and walked the little path I had walked before, the gravel soft underfoot. The valve house door was locked. The padlock was old. I circled, listened for the guard's husky breathing, checked for cars in the lot, and then ducked into the shadows near the boat slips. No dramatic heroics, no film-worthy blowtorch, just a man and a plan leaning into the silence. I wrote my final note on scrap paper. Factual, cold, not a threat. I placed it where it would be found. In the valve house's mailbox. Folded precisely, the edges crisp. The choice to be surgical felt good. There is a particular kind of power in letting bureaucracy stumble over its own lies in the open. The note would prompt questions. The questions would prompt records. Records would prompt lawyers or apologies or both. And in the middle of it all, my barn's bones would be carried in the memory of the town, rather than the dust on my lawn. As I walked back to my truck, a sound made me freeze. A crunch of gravel, then the soft click of a flashlight. The guard. He wasn't supposed to make rounds yet. He slowed, peered into the dark where I stood, and for a breath, the world narrowed into the beam of his light and the thump of my pulse. I could have walked away. I could have stayed put and let the night fold up into excuses. Instead, I tipped my chin and let the light find me. The guard called out, voice flat, "You lost, sir." "No," I said, and my voice sounded more even than I felt. "Just checking the place. Leave a note for them. Tell them I was here." The guard squinted. We both knew how thin the line would be between this and a scene someone else could narrate into guilt. He grunted, the universal sound of mystery, unresolved, and went back to his circuit. I drove back home, with my heart beating a hard rhythm that felt like victory braided with risk. The package was out. The reporter had things to chew on, and the HOA was scrambling in a way it had never scrambled before. They had taken my barn, and maybe, if I played this right, they would have to reckon with what they'd built on the backs of convenience and selective enforcement. There was still more to do. There were interviews to leak, more documents to coax into daylight, and, if necessary, a public reveal staged, where neighbors could see the difference between brochure paradise and reality. The path forward was messy in the best possible way. No violence, only exposure, and a public witness. The barn's nails had been ripped from wood, but the truth had itself become a nail, and I intended to hammer it down where it would hurt. That night, I lay awake and listened to the familiar chorus of crickets. The plan felt right. It felt dangerous in the way that promises to yourself feel dangerous when you intend to keep them. And in the morning, when the sun hit the pile of timber where my barn used to stand, I eyed the horizon and thought about the resort lake, the valve house, and the faces that would soon have to answer to a question they hadn't seen coming. What happens when you treat a life like a regulation? The next morning, the pile of splintered wood glistened under the sun, wet from last night's dew. I walked around what remained of the barn, picking up a piece of wood that had once been part of the loft. The smell of old hay lingering in the grain. There was anger in every fiber, but also clarity. The first strike had been made, subtle but unavoidable. The HOA had their headlines. Barn demolished for code violations. And I had my leverage. The next phase required patience, observation, and a meticulous approach. This wasn't about chaos. It was about optics, about letting their own hubris unravel in public view. By mid-morning, I had mapped out a schedule. The resort lake was busiest during weekends, but the weekdays offered opportunity. Staff rotated, board members attended meetings, and security was less alert. My plan would need precise timing. The valve house, the central point of my next move, could not be approached casually. I spent hours sketching diagrams, not of water levels, but of line of sight, potential witnesses, and escape routes. My goal was simple: deliver a message that disrupted their carefully curated image of perfection. without endangering anyone physically. I made a list of potential witnesses and allies, local reporters, disgruntled neighbors, contractors with loose tongues, and even some board members, quietly frustrated with Langley's iron grip. Each could be nudged in the right direction to amplify the consequences of the HOA's arrogance. I had the documents, the photos, the timeline of demolition, and now I needed the right stage. Over the next week, I became a ghost in the neighborhood. I observed the resort from discreet distances, the way board members greeted guests, the casual arrogance in their body language, the hidden cameras they used to monitor minor infractions. They were confident in their own bubble. Perfect. Bubbles are fragile things, and my plan was designed to puncture theirs. I also began talking to people quietly, casually, planting seeds. A neighbor would overhear a comment about how quickly things escalated with the barn. A local contractor would mention discrepancies in maintenance records. Each small conversation, seemingly innocent, started to paint a picture. The HOA's paradise was not as flawless as it appeared. Meanwhile, I dug deeper into the resort lake's infrastructure. The valve house was more than a metal door and a padlock. It was a symbol of control. I discovered maintenance logs showing how minor adjustments could subtly change water flow without creating danger. I made mental notes, but I didn't act yet. Timing was everything. An early move could alert the HOA before the package reached the reporter, or before other evidence was in place. I needed the perfect window. Then came the breakthrough. The board had a scheduled weekend retreat at the resort. All key members would be there, presenting a perfect opportunity for visibility and impact. I marked it on my calendar. Every conversation, every move I made in the next few days was synchronized toward this moment. At night, I revisited the barn site, taking stock of what had been lost and what remained. The old tractor was still in the shed, partially shielded, and the loft beams, though splintered, were intact. Memories of laughter, late-night repairs, and quiet mornings fueled my resolve. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about principle. You couldn't bulldoze a life's work and expect silence in return. Finally, the day arrived. I parked a safe distance from the resort and observed. Security was in place, guests mingled, and board members moved confidently along the paths. I waited, timing the movements of each individual with precision. My package had already been delivered, my messages were circulating, and the public narrative was beginning to tilt in my favor. Approaching the valve house required stealth and care. I moved along the tree line, avoiding cameras, keeping to shadows. The gravel crunched softly underfoot, each step calculated. I reached the shed, examined the padlock. It was old, susceptible, but I did not touch it yet. This was about message, not destruction. Inside, I placed evidence of my observations, photographs, diagrams, a note documenting the HOA's discrepancies. Everything was factual, undeniable, and visible to anyone who opened the door. Then I retreated, leaving the shed as I found it, but with the message embedded. Anyone looking would see not chaos, but truth, an inconvenient truth, for a group that prided itself on control. By midday, the effects began to ripple. Staff discovered the documents, murmurs spread among guests, and the board convened in confusion. Phones rang, voices rose, and the polished image they curated for years started to crack. It was subtle, yet powerful. The panic wasn't visible yet, but the undercurrent of doubt was unmistakable. From my vantage point, I watched as the first cracks appeared. Langley's confident posture faltered. Mrs. Hargreave whispered urgently into her phone, and the consultant they had hired was frantically organizing the pieces of the puzzle. My role was observational, patient. The story was unfolding, and I had set the stage perfectly. That night, I returned home. exhausted but satisfied. The barn may have been gone, but the leverage was mine. The HOA had learned, subtly but unmistakably, that actions have consequences, and power without accountability is fragile. I had struck without violence, without direct confrontation, yet with undeniable effect. The next phase was to let the ripple grow, to ensure the narrative reached the right eyes and ears. The package, the documents, the observations, they were seeds. Now they needed to bloom. And bloom they would, because the HOA had underestimated the quiet, patient man whose barn they demolished. They called it a smear campaign. I called it a reckoning. The morning the reporter's piece went live, my phone began to buzz like a beehive someone had prodded. The article wasn't sensationalist. It didn't need to be. It simply laid out the facts, demolition permits, the timing, inconsistencies in maintenance logs, photos of my barn in stages of being unmade, and a line that made the board's carefully curated narrative look paper thin. A community that polishes its image for private use may not tolerate the liability of enforcing its rules in public. The words landed like rocks in a pond. Ripples radiated outward. Neighbors sent messages, some angry, some confused, some quietly apologetic. A woman I'd waved to for years dropped by with 2 pies and a look that said she'd been uncomfortable at board meetings but didn't know how to speak up. The pies were a small mercy. I ate one in the truck and let the other cool on my kitchen counter like a symbol. The reporter's phone interview aired on the local morning show. A few callers were furious at me for staging things. Others demanded the board explain itself. The resort's review threads, filled with 1-star complaints from renters who felt misled by glossy photos. The HOA's PR consultant published a statement about procedural correctness and public safety, but the phrasing sounded tinny after the reporter's careful work. That afternoon, a lawyer's letter arrived on heavy paper, every sentence a kind of formal thunder. The HOA claimed defamation, trespass, and unauthorized interference with private property. It was the language of people who believed the law was their cudgel. I read it twice, then folded it and placed it under my coffee cup. Lawyers were expected. Lawyers could be countered by lawyers, and lawyers could be soothed by public opinion. The letter was a predictable escalation, nothing more. But escalation has a way of revealing things you didn't expect. One of the contractors, whose name appeared in the reporter's folder, called me hesitantly the next day. He'd been building docks and decks in town for years, calloused palms and a wry laugh. They cut corners on the dock pilings, he said in a low voice. I told Langley once, and he told me to make the paperwork sing. His contradiction was small and human, but valuable. He agreed to talk, with caveats. No public appearance, only verified questions. I gave him that courtesy, and he gave me a grain more truth. At the next board meeting, the air was thicker than usual. People arrived in pairs, clutching papers, clutching opinions. Langley attempted his usual calm, but sweat glistened at the collar. Mrs. Hargreave read a prepared statement about safety and community standards. Voices rose. I watched from the back of the room and felt the strange mixture of vindication and sorrow. The room had once been a place where neighbors swapped seedlings and recipes. Today it smelled of fear and antiseptic paper. Then something happened I hadn't counted on. An ally emerged from an unexpected place. The resort's groundskeeper, an old man who kept the fish fed and the grass mown, stepped to the microphone. He spoke plainly about how he'd been told to ignore minor erosion on the lake's inlet because it didn't fit the brochure. He talked about a memo that instructed staff to prioritize the appearance of the shoreline over long-term maintenance. His voice was steady. The room went quiet. People shifted in their seats. There was a human honesty in his account that cut through the board's practiced rhetoric. For many in that room, it was the first time their paradise had been described as a construction project more than a public good. The meeting swelled into a chaotic conversation. Some neighbors defended the HOA. No one liked disorder. Rules keep things civil, they said. Others wanted accountability. A few asked the simple, devastating question: how did we end up policing our neighbors, but not our own infrastructure? That was the pivot. The narrative was no longer about a single barn. It was about an institutional pattern of selective enforcement and cosmetic fixes. Langley tried to steer the conversation toward procedure and paperwork, but the seeds planted by the reporter, the contractor, and the groundskeeper had already sprouted. A small faction of homeowners demanded an independent audit of the resort's maintenance and the HOA's permit history. The motion passed by a narrow margin, and the room erupted into a noise of relieved whispers. Thin as the first rain on a long drought, the board's legal team fired off another letter immediately, this time to the reporter, threatening a libel suit unless corrections were issued. The lawyer's threats sounded like a trumped-up drumbeat. The reporter's editor replied with something I loved: "We stand by our reporting." That sentence, short and clean, felt like a second kindling. Journalists can be stubborn in the best way. Once they've seen paper that matches a picture, they don't look the other way. In the following days, the HOA shifted. They formed a committee that would review community concerns. A phrase designed to look like action. The consultant appeared on local radio, assuring residents that safety and compliance were their top priorities, and that any missteps would be corrected. I listened to these assurances with a guarded cynicism. Lip service is often the first layer of repair before anything real changes. There was also pushback, social friction in small-town scale. A neighbor with a well-tended hedge, who'd always kept to herself, stopped returning my waves. Someone scrawled "troublemaker" on a flyer pinned to the bulletin board. Unsubtle, spelled like it had been scribbled in a rush. I left the flyer where it was. Public fights make cowards and heroes out of ordinary people, and the way each neighbor reacted revealed their thresholds for discomfort, for solidarity, for fear. At home, nights were restless. My barn's shadow on the grass was gone, replaced by a rectangle of exposed sun where roofs once met. I walked that perimeter with slow steps and counted my losses, not just lumber and tar, but the stories tied to each beam. I kept a small box in which I placed nails, a splintered hinge, a photograph of my father leaning on the tractor. They became talismans I handled on difficult mornings. When the audit report finally arrived, an independent review, conducted by structural engineers and municipal inspectors. It read like a ledger of small compromises made large. The dock pilings had been underspecified. Maintenance reports had been redacted in ways that raised questions. The demolition permit for my barn, while claimed to be valid, had footnotes that didn't align with state code language. There were recommendations: fix the shoreline, reassess contractor oversight, implement transparent permit logs. For many, the report was a mirror held up to the board's face. For others, it was a fast-forward to legal maneuvering. As expected, the board responded with a mix of contrition and defiance. They instituted nominal changes: a new record-keeping app, a volunteer oversight committee, promises to review contractor vetting procedures. Some of it felt genuine, some felt theatrical, but theater can become reality when the audience keeps watching. I kept watching. Then, in an unexpected twist that made me laugh despite myself, the resort's weekend guest began to act as an unlikely jury. A guest who ran a wedding planning business left a scathing review, noting that the resort's perfect shoreline had been stabilized with temporary fixes that wouldn't last. A family who'd rented a lakeside cabin posted a video of small, persistent leaks in the dock area. The internet did something strange and useful. It multiplied testimony. The HOA's polished image, so carefully curated in glossy pamphlets, could not withstand the compound effect of multiple small stories shared in full light. Through it all, I never lost sight of a core principle. This was not about humiliation as retribution. It was about insisting that power should be accountable. I didn't want to ruin anyone's life. I wanted to make sure demolitions weren't launched from a place of unchecked whim, and that people who built the neighborhood's dream were asked to maintain it, honestly. Months passed, and the fight settled into a new rhythm. Some board members resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. Others lost re-election bids to neighbors who promised transparency. Langley, whose tenure had been built on a careful orchestration of order, found himself mired in petty hearings and paperwork. His calm voice on the public stage frayed like an old rope. And for me, the aftermath was a strange mix of satisfaction and lingering ache. My barn's bones were gone, but its story had become larger than a single man's loss. People gathered in my yard one Saturday. Neighbors, the groundskeeper, the contractor who'd finally spoken openly, and the reporter who had set the whole thing in motion. We drank coffee from paper cups and talked about the little ways a community could be better. There was no triumphant music, no vengeful chorus, just conversation, awkward and necessary, like a town negotiating its own conscience. The barn's absence left a space for other things to grow. A small community garden proposal, a campaign for clearer maintenance protocols, an open forum that actually allowed candid questions. It wasn't perfect. It was not a fairy tale where wrongs were righted in a single chapter. It was a messy, human, sometimes bureaucratic progress that felt, if not poetic, at least honest. On quiet evenings, I still walk the line of where the barn used to stand. I touch the corner post that remains, sturdy and stubborn, and imagine building again someday, differently, not as an act of defiance, but as an assertion that a life, no matter how modest, deserves respect and protection. The resort lake sparkles the same as ever. Fishermen cast their lines, and the groundskeeper still hums beneath his breath. The valve house sits in the same place it always did, but no more a symbol of untouchable control than the community itself. A thing of people, faults, and the possibility of repair. By the time spring arrived, the town was humming with quiet conversations that weren't supposed to happen. Neighbors who had never questioned HOA authority were now whispering about permits, maintenance, and board accountability. Some of it was gossip, yes, but some of it was grounded in truth. The kind that makes people start looking closely at the foundations of a system they'd always assumed was infallible. And me? I was no longer just the man whose barn had been demolished. I had become a signal, a reminder that actions have consequences, even in places that look polished and perfect. I spent more time at the perimeter of the resort lake now, not out of obsession, but observation. The valve house remained unchanged in structure, but its reputation had shifted. People walked past it with a different awareness, and I could see the board members' reactions when they passed. Stiffened shoulders, eyes darting to the small metal shed, a subtle but unmistakable reminder that their paradise was never entirely in their control. That quiet, almost imperceptible power is the most satisfying kind, the one that doesn't require noise or destruction. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. The reporter, notebook in hand, wanted an update. "It's building," she said, excitement laced in her voice. "People are talking. The board's scrambling. Your package. The documents. The story. It's still spreading." She was right. Even without constant attention, the ripple effect was growing. Word of mouth, social media, and the audit report combined into a slow, persistent pressure. The HOA's carefully constructed image was losing integrity, bit by bit. like old paint peeling in sun and wind. Not that I was idle. I had taken to walking the streets near the resort in plain sight, subtly documenting everything. I recorded who arrived and left, when security made rounds, and what maintenance staff actually did versus what was on paper. All of this was to strengthen the narrative. If the HOA tried to spin or suppress the story, the truth would already be there, methodically preserved. Precision and patience were the tools of my trade now, not malice. Then came a moment that surprised me. A board member approached me in a neutral tone one morning at the local coffee shop. Mr. Duncan, a quiet man who had always been polite but uninvolved, asked to talk. "I want to understand," he said. "What happened with the barn? Everything. The process. The mistakes." For a moment, I felt the strange mix of vindication and caution. Offering clarity to someone genuinely seeking it was different than reacting to arrogance or hostility. I nodded, ordered 2 coffees, and walked him through the timeline, the inconsistencies, and the consequences. He listened, really listened, which was rare. By the end, he looked at me with something like respect. "You forced us to see what we couldn't see before," he admitted. Not easy, but necessary. Meanwhile, the public perception of the resort lake shifted. Guests became aware of the behind-the-scenes friction. Reviews, once glowing, now carried pointed observations about discrepancies between brochure and reality. Staff members, emboldened by the transparency movement sparked by my actions, began speaking up more, raising issues about overlooked maintenance and procedural shortcuts. It was the butterfly effect in motion. Small, seemingly mundane acts leading to larger consequences. One weekend, I made my way back to the resort under the pretense of a casual walk. The lake shimmered under the late afternoon sun, boats bobbing gently at the docks, children laughing nearby. The valve house loomed as a silent sentinel, unaltered physically, but changed symbolically. Its presence reminded the board, staff, and guests alike that even the most controlled environments have vulnerabilities. I walked the perimeter slowly, a quiet observer of a system that was learning accountability, one ripple at a time. By late spring, I knew the story had entered a new phase. The HOA was attempting damage control, but the narrative had slipped from their grasp. Emails circulated among homeowners demanding audits, transparency, and formal apologies. Meetings became forums for questioning, rather than decrees. The board was still present, but their authority had been tempered by the undeniable fact that their paradise was not untouchable. One evening, I sat on the remains of my barn's foundation, drinking coffee and reflecting on the months that had passed. The initial anger had cooled into something steadier, a recognition that my actions had catalyzed change, but the work of accountability was ongoing. I touched the splintered wood beneath my fingertips and smiled faintly. My barn's physical form was gone, but its spirit had been a catalyst for clarity, for conversation, and for an awakening that couldn't be erased. And then I thought about the next move. The auditor's report had suggested improvements, but implementation was patchy at best. I began planning subtle, legal, and visible demonstrations of transparency that could keep pressure on the board without risking anyone's safety or my own freedom. Every observation, every photo, every carefully documented inconsistency was now a tool, not a weapon, not a threat, but a mechanism for accountability. By the end of part 5, it was clear. The barn was gone, the resort lake remained, but the landscape, social, procedural, and symbolic, had been altered irrevocably. I had set a course that reminded the HOA and the community that oversight matters, and that the arrogance of unchecked power is always vulnerable. The story wasn't over, but the foundations of change had been laid, quietly, methodically, and inevitably. That's all for today, folks. This story has part 2. Please do watch the part 2, which will be published day after tomorrow. Stay tuned. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!